The spring of 1881 arrived in the Wyoming Territory with little mercy. Snow still clung to the peaks, icy winds swept across the plains, and the earth seemed determined to remind every rancher that survival was earned, never gifted. Men who had crossed half a continent chasing freedom often discovered that the frontier offered neither comfort nor forgiveness. It only respected those who refused to quit. No one understood that better than Caleb Thornton. At 42, Caleb had become a man whose silence spoke louder than most conversations. Years of driving cattle through blizzards, burying friends beside lonely trails, and rebuilding fences after endless storms had carved deep lines across his face. His ranch rested several miles outside the small settlement of Ash Creek, where endless grasslands met rugged hills. It wasn't the biggest ranch in the territory, but every post, every stable beam, and every stretch of fencing had been built with his own hands. The townsfolk respected him. They also avoided him. Caleb wasn't cruel. He simply lived as though the world had already taken everything worth loving. 7 years earlier, his fiancée, Margaret Ellis, had died from a fever before their wedding. Since that day, Caleb had buried not only the woman he loved but also every dream that had once lived inside him. The laughter disappeared first. Then the music. Then the habit of sitting on his porch to watch sunsets. Eventually, even visitors stopped knocking. His ranch became a place where only horses, cattle, and hard work were welcome. Every morning began before sunrise. Every night ended with a lonely supper beside a cold fireplace. It suited him. Or at least that was the lie he repeated often enough to believe. By late April, however, the ranch itself began revealing a truth Caleb could no longer ignore. The fences needed repairs faster than he could manage. The horses required grooming. The vegetable garden had nearly vanished beneath weeds. Cooking consisted of burnt bacon, stale biscuits, and coffee bitter enough to wake the dead. One evening, after throwing another ruined skillet into the wash basin, Caleb muttered to himself, "I need help. Not friendship. Not company. Certainly not love. Just another pair of working hands." The following morning he rode into Ash Creek and pinned a handwritten notice outside the general store. Housekeeper wanted. Cooking. Cleaning. Honest wages. Room provided. Must not fear hard work. Nothing more. Nothing less. For nearly 3 weeks, no one answered. The paper faded beneath the spring rain, and Caleb assumed no respectable person intended to live miles away with a rancher whose conversations rarely lasted longer than a sentence. Then, one windy afternoon, something unexpected appeared on the distant trail. A weather-beaten wagon. It rolled slowly across the prairie, pulled by an aging chestnut horse that looked almost as exhausted as the driver. The wagon carried little more than a few blankets, 2 wooden trunks, and hopes that seemed too fragile for such an unforgiving country. Caleb stood beside the corral, watching without expression. When the wagon finally stopped outside his gate, a young woman climbed down. She couldn't have been older than 28. Her name, Caleb would soon learn, was Charlotte Bennett. Golden brown hair escaped beneath a faded bonnet, and dust covered the hem of her blue traveling dress. She looked tired, far more tired than someone her age should, but there remained an unmistakable dignity in the way she stood. She neither apologized for arriving nor expected sympathy. She simply met Caleb's eyes. Behind her climbed a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, clutching a rag doll stitched from old fabric. Then came a boy of about 11 carrying a fishing pole that had clearly survived better days. Caleb frowned. His advertisement had mentioned nothing about children. Charlotte walked toward the gate before speaking. "Mr. Thornton?" He nodded. "I came about your notice." His gaze shifted toward the children. "You didn't mention them. I couldn't leave them behind." The words carried no embarrassment, only truth. The little girl stepped closer to her mother while the older boy quietly positioned himself between Caleb and his sister, protective despite his youth. Caleb noticed immediately. The boy had learned responsibility far too early. "I need someone to run my household," Caleb said evenly. "Not a family." Charlotte accepted the words without flinching. "I understand." She rested one hand on the wagon. "My husband was killed last winter during a stagecoach robbery outside Laramie. Since then I've worked wherever people would hire me. Most employers welcomed a cook until they saw 2 children standing beside her." A cold gust swept across the valley. Neither of them spoke. Finally she continued. If you send us away, I won't argue. But I promised my children we'd keep moving until we found an honest place. Silence settled between them. Caleb looked toward the horizon, then toward the ranch house, then back at the two children, whose eyes carried more courage than fear. Especially the little girl. She suddenly smiled. Not because she expected kindness. Simply because she believed strangers deserved one. For reasons Caleb couldn't explain, that innocent smile unsettled something buried deep inside him, something he had spent years convincing himself no longer existed. He folded his arms. What are your children's names? Charlotte blinked, surprised he had asked. The boy is Ethan. She rested her hand gently on the little girl's shoulder. And this is Lucy. Lucy lifted her rag doll. Her name's Daisy, she announced proudly. For the first time in 7 years, Caleb Thornton felt the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Just the forgotten memory of one. And without realizing it, he found himself asking the question that would quietly begin changing every part of his carefully guarded life. Can you bake fresh bread? The question lingered in the cool afternoon air. Can you bake fresh bread? Charlotte looked at Caleb for a moment, uncertain whether he was serious or simply searching for a polite way to refuse her. Then a faint smile crossed her face. I can, she answered. My mother used to say a loaf of bread tells you everything about the hands that made it. Caleb gave a slow nod. I suppose I'll find out if she was right. He unlatched the ranch gate and stepped aside. The bunkhouse is empty. It isn't fancy, but the roof doesn't leak. You and the children can stay there. Meals are served before sunrise, noon, and after evening chores. If you're willing to work, you've got a place here. Charlotte released a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Don't thank me yet, he replied. You've only just arrived. By sunset, the old bunkhouse had already begun to feel different. Charlotte swept years of dust from the floor while Ethan repaired a loose window shutter without being asked. Little Lucy wandered outside gathering wildflowers, insisting every room needed something pretty. Caleb noticed. He pretended not to. When supper arrived, the aroma drifting from the kitchen reached the barn before the dinner bell ever rang. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, beef stew seasoned with herbs Caleb hadn't tasted since childhood. He stepped inside cautiously, almost as though entering someone else's home. Charlotte placed a warm loaf on the table. Dinner's ready. Caleb removed his hat and sat without a word. He tore off a piece of bread. Steam escaped from the center. He took one bite. The room became impossibly quiet. Not because there was no sound, but because, for the first time in years, his thoughts stopped racing long enough to appreciate something simple. It'll do, he muttered. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. It'll do? He cleared his throat. It's better than what I've been making. She smiled. I'll consider that a compliment. Across the yard, Lucy laughed as Ethan chased her around an old water trough. The cheerful voices drifted through the open window. Normally the noise would have irritated Caleb. Instead, he found himself listening. The ranch no longer sounded abandoned. It sounded alive. Days settled into an easy rhythm. Charlotte woke before dawn each morning, kneading dough while coffee simmered over the stove. Ethan proved remarkably capable around livestock, quickly learning how to repair fences and saddle horses. Lucy, however, seemed determined to befriend every creature on the ranch. She named the chickens. She talked to the horses. She even insisted the old ranch dog, Rusty, smiled whenever she sang to him. Caleb insisted dogs couldn't smile. Lucy insisted they absolutely could. Neither convinced the other. One afternoon, while Caleb repaired a section of broken fencing, Ethan approached carrying a hammer. You missed a nail, the boy said quietly. Caleb glanced back. You've got sharp eyes. My father always said fences tell you whether a rancher pays attention. Caleb studied him for a long moment. And was your father right? Ethan nodded. He usually was. Without another word, Caleb handed him the hammer. The two worked side by side beneath the warm spring sun. No conversation. No awkward introductions. Just the steady rhythm of wood, steel, and shared purpose. Sometimes silence built walls. Other times it built trust. That evening, rain clouds gathered over the hills. Charlotte stood beneath the porch roof watching lightning flash beyond the distant ridges. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Caleb joined her. "Beautiful doesn't always mean safe." She looked toward him. "You've lived here a long time. My whole life. And you've always been alone?" He stared into the gathering storm. "For longer than I care to count." Charlotte didn't press further. She understood grief well enough to recognize it when she heard it hiding inside another person's voice. Instead, she simply stood beside him. No questions. No sympathy. Only quiet companionship. For reasons Caleb couldn't explain, it was exactly what he needed. The storm broke shortly after midnight. Thunder rolled across the valley as rain pounded the rooftops. Then came another sound. A horse. Running hard. Caleb was already pulling on his boots when frantic knocking echoed across the front door. He opened it to find Ethan standing in the rain, completely soaked. "Mr. Thornton, what is it?" "The south pasture." The boy struggled to catch his breath. "The river's rising." A flash of lightning illuminated the valley beyond. In that brief burst of white light, Caleb saw it. Water rushing through the pasture. Broken fencing. And nearly 40 head of cattle moving straight toward the flooded riverbank. Without another word, Caleb reached for his rifle, grabbed his saddle, and looked at Ethan. "Wake your mother." He swung into the saddle. "If we don't stop that herd before sunrise." He looked once toward the raging river. "We'll lose everything." The lightning split the night sky as Caleb tightened his grip on the reins. "If we don't stop that herd before sunrise." He had warned. "We'll lose everything." Without waiting another second, he spurred his bay gelding toward the south pasture. Ethan rode close behind on a smaller ranch horse, determination replacing the fear that had filled his face only moments earlier. Behind them, Charlotte stood beneath the porch, holding Lucy close while the rain soaked the front steps. She watched the two riders disappear into the darkness, whispering a prayer the storm carried into the wind. The river had become a roaring monster. Hours of relentless rain had transformed the usually gentle stream into a wall of rushing water that tore trees from the banks and swallowed everything in its path. Broken fence posts floated downstream while frightened cattle scattered across the muddy pasture. "There!" Ethan shouted, pointing toward the herd. Nearly 40 cattle were drifting closer to the collapsing riverbank. Caleb wasted no time. "We push them east," he yelled above the thunder. The two riders spread apart, guiding the terrified animals away from the flood. Rain stung their faces. Horses slipped through deep mud. More than once Caleb thought the current would claim both man and beast. Then disaster struck. A section of soaked ground gave way beneath Ethan's horse. The animal stumbled. Horse and rider crashed into the swollen edge of the river. "Ethan!" Caleb forced his horse through waist-deep water without hesitation. The current seized the frightened boy, pulling him toward the racing river. Ethan struggled desperately, but the water was too strong. Caleb leaned dangerously from the saddle. "Take my hand." For one terrifying second, Ethan disappeared beneath the muddy water. Then his hand broke the surface. Caleb caught it. Every muscle in his body burned as he pulled with everything he had. His horse dug its hooves into the slippery ground, refusing to surrender. Slowly, inch by inch, they reached solid earth. Ethan collapsed onto the grass, coughing river water from his lungs. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally the boy looked up. "You came back." Caleb frowned. "Of course I did. My father couldn't." The words were barely louder than the falling rain. Caleb rested a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm not your father." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "But tonight, you didn't leave me." The word settled deep inside Caleb's heart. By dawn, the storm had passed. The cattle were safe. The ranch had survived. When Caleb and Ethan rode back into the yard, Charlotte hurried forward. Relief filled her eyes the instant she saw her son alive. She embraced Ethan first. Then she turned toward Caleb. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally she whispered, "Thank you." He simply nodded. Some debts needed no reply. Summer arrived, bringing warm mornings and fields rich with green grass. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Charlotte's laughter slowly returned. Lucy filled every corner of the ranch with flowers she insisted belonged inside the house instead of outside. Ethan became Caleb's shadow, learning everything about horses, cattle, and honest work. The lonely ranch that had once echoed with silence now carried the sounds of family. Caleb found himself repairing things he had ignored for years. He painted the porch. He rebuilt the old garden fence. He even polished the dusty piano that had belonged to his mother, though no one had touched it in decades. Charlotte noticed every change. She also noticed the man making them. One quiet evening, they sat together on the porch while the children chased fireflies across the yard. "The ranch looks different," she said. Caleb smiled faintly. "It isn't the ranch." She looked toward him. "No." He shook his head. "It was always the same place." "What changed then?" He watched Lucy laughing beneath the fading sunset while Ethan helped Rusty chase a rabbit across the field. "I stopped living in yesterday." Charlotte reached over and gently placed her hand beside his. "Not over it. Not forcing anything. Simply close enough that he could choose." After a long moment, he turned his hand and held hers. Neither of them needed grand speeches. The frontier had taught them that actions carried more truth than promises. Several weeks later, the annual Ash Creek Harvest Gathering brought nearly every ranching family together. Music echoed across the square. Children laughed. Lanterns glowed beneath the evening sky. Caleb rarely attended such events. This year was different. While couples danced beneath strings of lantern light, Lucy tugged gently on Caleb's sleeve. "Are you going to ask Mama to dance?" He chuckled softly. "I haven't danced in years." "Then it's about time." Charlotte overheard and smiled. "You don't have to." "I know." He took a slow breath. "But I'd like to." As the fiddler began another tune, Caleb extended his hand. "Miss Bennett, would you honor me?" Her eyes sparkled. "I thought you'd never ask." They stepped onto the dance floor. It wasn't perfect. Caleb missed a step. Charlotte laughed. Soon he laughed too. The people of Ash Creek quietly smiled as they watched the rancher everyone believed had buried his heart years ago dancing beneath the lanterns with the woman who had unknowingly brought it back to life. Before autumn returned, Caleb stood with Charlotte beside the old oak tree overlooking the ranch. "Ethan." The boy stepped forward. "I've been thinking." "Yes, sir. If you're willing." Caleb paused. "I'd like to teach you everything I know about this ranch." Ethan's eyes widened. "You mean?" "I can't build a future alone anymore." The boy smiled. "I'd like that." Lucy threw her arms around Caleb's waist. "So does that make us your family now?" He looked at Charlotte. She nodded gently. Caleb knelt beside the little girl. "It does." Lucy hugged him tighter. "I knew you'd say yes." Charlotte slipped her hand into Caleb's as the evening sun settled behind the Wyoming hills. Years earlier, he had believed the frontier had taken everything worth loving. Instead, it had quietly led a weary widow, a brave young boy, and a little girl with endless hope to the gate of a lonely ranch. He had asked for a housekeeper. What arrived was something far greater. A family that filled empty rooms with laughter. A woman whose quiet strength reminded him that love could grow again. And 2 children who taught a lonely cowboy that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones willing to open once more. As the wind swept gently across the prairie, Caleb looked over the home that no longer felt empty. For the first time in many years, the silence was gone, and he knew he would never miss it again.